The Keynesian Multiplier, the perpetual motion machine of economics. Lies my economics professor told me. Milei has called the Keynesian multiplier a kind of miracle of the multiplication of bread. But before we point out the errors in the whole thought process of the Keynesian multiplier, let's examine what his thought process was for coming up with this idea. According to Google's AI, the Keynes multiplier describes how an initial investment, government spending, or export increases by the Keynesian multiplier. It is a theory showing that an initial injection of money into the economy results in a proportionally larger increase in aggregate demand. This happens because of the circular flow of income. When money is spent, it goes to someone else who spends it, and so on. This chart shows the math behind the Keynesian multiplier. As it shows, the multiplier is equal to 1 divided by 1 minus the MPC, which is the marginal propensity to consume. And in this slightly more simplified version of the multiplier, all income is either consumed or saved. So the MPC and the MPS, marginal propensity to save, must add up to 1, which means the multiplier is just 1 over the MPS. This simplified version of the multiplier does not change any of the criticisms that will come later. The example below shows how this is used. The MPC, that's the marginal propensity to consume, says that if you get an extra $100, how much of it will you consume? How much of it will you spend or save? In this example, they have an MPC of 0.6 or 60%. That makes the multiplier equal to 2.5. According to this, it means that if the government spends $1 billion on a new project, the total increase in GDP will be 1 billion times 2.5 or $2.5 billion. To understand where Keynes came up with this multiplier, you have to understand the idea that if the government spends $100, that $100 is income to the person who receives it. Then he saves a part of it, and then he spends a part of it. And this process goes on infinitum. Thus, in this example, if a person saves $50, then he spends $50. That $50 he spent, according to Keynes, is income to the next person. And if that person also is saving half of it and spending half of it, the next person gets $25 of income. As you can see, in the case I've chosen, this is the infinite series of 1 plus 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8 and so on, which is just 1/2 to the nth power. Which you can see from this chart, this geometric series adds up to this equation. In this equation, they always set A1 equal to 1. That way you can use the multiplier against multiple potential GDP scenarios. R is the MPC, or marginal propensity consume, which in this case I set to 1/2. Note, in this slightly more simplified version, the marginal propensity consume plus the marginal propensity to save has to equal 1. Thus, it's easy to see what Keynes did is take an infinite geometric series, meaning an infinite number of transactions, to see how much it affects the GDP. While this is impressive looking math, at least to those people who don't have a strong science and engineering background, the question is it correct, or is Keynes just snowing us with mathematical equations? The first assumption, which is not explicitly stated in this equation, is that the total expenses in the economy equal the total income. Anyone who's run a business or taken an accounting class or even done a family budget should be blown away by the absurdity of this assumption. Essentially, this assumption assumes that all revenue and income are exactly the same thing. I think it's only possible to make this stupid mistake because money is used. When people start talking about economics in terms of money, they get very confused. If I pay an auto mechanic $100 to repair my car, he doesn't have $100 of income. He has the expense of his shop, he has the expense of his employees, he also has other expenses. So this is not pure profit. And if you eliminate money, like you take the situation of a hunter, the hunter goes out and he tries to shoot a deer to eat. It costs him calories to go out and hunt the deer. Even if he's successful in capturing or shooting a deer, the calories that he gets, the profit he gets, that is the income he gets, is equal to the calories he gets out of the deer minus the energy he took to kill the deer. So essentially, Keynes and the Keynesian multiplier assumes a frictionless economy. In other words, a perpetual motion economy, where one person's expense is another person's income. This is absurd, but that's not the end of the mistakes in the Keynesian multiplier. First of all, the infinite series that Keynes assumes is only true if everyone's marginal propensity to save is the same. And in fact, what they're doing is measuring gross marginal propensity to save across a whole country, which is just an average at best, even given the inaccuracy of the data being collected. And there's absolutely no justification for this mathematical assumption that you can use the average instead of the individual MPCs. In fact, if the first person's marginal propensity to consume is 90%, then you get a whole different answer no matter what the other marginal propensities to save are. So this is just a pure mathematical snow job bullshit. Keynes is using math in an attempt to make his ideas appear more scientific. The third obvious problem is that he assumes that there's an infinite number of transactions, that when the government spends $100, that people just instantly convert that into an infinite number of transactions. This is clearly absurd on its face, but you might argue that there are enough transactions that it doesn't matter. But in fact, we have some information on this. Economists track something called the money velocity, which is the number of times that money turns over in a given year. Or stated another way, that's the average number of transactions for a given amount of money in a year. According to this chart, the money velocity in the US over 5 decades varied between 1.6 and 2, not an infinite number of transactions. So this infinite series is nonsense and needs to be truncated at 1 or 2. If we truncate the answer where the marginal propensity to consume is 1/2 at just 2 transactions, then instead of a multiplier of 2, we end up a multiplier of 1.75. But the Keynesian bullshit doesn't end there. They don't take into account how the government got the money to spend. If the government revenue comes from taxation, then they've taken that money out of the economy. So the government spending is a wash at best, subtracting from the multiplier by 1. If the marginal propensity to consume is 1/2, even under their absurd assumptions, the multiplier is now 1 instead of 2. But of course, we know the reality is that when the government taxes income, it doesn't come frictionlessly. There's the money that it takes to collect it, and money that has to be spent by the consumer to calculate their income tax. This takes away from private citizens' ability to do other transactions and be productive, which reduces the GDP. In addition, the government almost never spends money in a productive way. In fact, government often gives money to bureaucrats whose whole job is to undermine economic activity. So to suggest that the government spending in any way increases GDP is one of the lies of Keynesianism. It's a lie that is incorporated into our gross domestic product calculation, which says that any government spending is immediately considered part of the GDP. This lie is just evil. The government does not produce anything. Even legitimate government spending is an expense, not production. Government spending should be subtracted from the GDP, not added to the GDP. If the government prints money in order to spend the money, then money has no backing at all. According to Keynes, by counterfeiting, we can grow the economy. In fact, if you take a look at his multiplier, he has no suggestion that there's any limitation. So as long as the government spends and prints, an infinite amount of money and spends an infinite amount of money will be infinitely wealthy. This is beyond absurd. And again, it points out that Keynesians think that they can create a perpetual motion machine. They think that the hunter can go out and hunt a deer without any cost or expense. It's also an example of the broken window fallacy, where the idea is that if you just break everyone's windows, then all those windows have to be replaced. So a bunch of money is spent in the economy. According to Keynesians, this increases the GDP. But of course, the people who had to replace the windows are not in any better situation than they were before. In fact, they're worse off, and that's not reflected in their stupid calculation. Now, if the government were to borrow the money, you still have the problem that by spending the money, the government is crowding out other private sector activities. So it's still creating a cost. But those aren't even the worst problems. Keynes actually provides no empirical evidence for his multiplier effect. And in fact, despite the lies of some economists, there's never been any evidence for a multiplier effect. What there has been is overwhelming evidence of a negative multiplier, not a positive multiplier, which clearly shows that Keynes is not talking about science. This whole Keynesian multiplier is just propaganda pretending to be science. There's no multiplier effect under any circumstances. This is just pixie dust and unicorn rainbow farts. Every professor who teaches this should be fired for malpractice, and any university who charges students for classes in Keynesian economics should be required to give them a refund plus the amount of damage done to their brain by wasting their time listening to this crap.
Mr. Madison, what you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
Okay, a simple wrong would have done just fine, but
You remain one.
As Milei explains, the reason why this shit is continuing to be taught is that it's a wet dream fantasy for a totalitarian politician. As Milei puts it in his understated way, Keynes' general theory is a pamphlet dedicated to corrupt and messianic thieves and politicians. That's why every time we find a politician of the worst sort, he'll always have a Keynesian economist giving him an endorsement. Keynes created the basis to justify theft. Not surprisingly, Keynes supported fascism. He also supported Hitler and Mussolini. He traveled to Russia and the Soviet Union and said that the system that they implemented is ideal, and his ideas are best practiced in a state like the Soviet Union. It's time that this nonsense be thrown on the trash heap of history. Keynes has done almost as much to increase human suffering as Marx. Long live freedom, damn it.